My name is Michael, and I work for a Microsoft-based consultancy based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a partner there. I've been working with this organization for actually just over 20 years now. And within the work that I do there, I help a lot of clients get to the cloud. So Office 365, Azure. Traditionally, I did a lot of work in the infrastructure space as well too. So if you needed to build a SharePoint farm, for example, I was the person that would architect that. Over the years, I've actually been involved in a lot of public speaking around the world. In fact, actually, on this slide, that's a Power BI map that I overlaid showing all the different locations that I've spoken at around the world, including back in 2009 in Pune, which I'll talk about here in a second on my next slide. But I'm fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to travel the world speaking on Microsoft technologies. I was awarded Microsoft MVP of 13 times over those years as well too. So it's been a pleasure. I continue to work within the Microsoft space very heavily, and right now I'm very heavily involved in the Microsoft security stack, including a lot of the different cloud-based security tools that we're going to be taking a look at. So so enough about me. Again, I did. Actually, the first city I ever visited in India back in 2009 was Pune. I spoke at, I'm not sure if anyone who's here was there, but I spoke at the user group back in 2009. So I had to dig up an old photo, and I found an old photo of the audience from back then, as well as a really brief stay that we had in the city. What was really unfortunate about it is I don't recall the details, but we were kind of rushed getting from the airport over to the event, and we really had very little time to do anything aside from the event before we had to head over to Chennai. So the unfortunate part about it is that I didn't really get to see much in Pune, and so I do hope to come back sometime and be able to see more than just the convention center and a couple buildings that we briefly saw. But always great to get to India. I've spoken multiple places around India and traveled around India as well too. So again, hopefully when things open up, I'll be able to come back again and do this again in person. So let's start by scaring you a little bit. And this session is broken up into the first half, which is where I really freak you out a little bit about what it is that hackers are able to do nowadays, and get you to start to think about the risks that are out there. And then transition into, well, what is it that you can do to protect yourself? Because there are always countermeasures to every type of attack that is out there. And as the hackers get more sophisticated, the tools that the organizations have to defend themselves also become more sophisticated. So we're going to be taking a look at the end as well into various Microsoft tools that are out there that can assist with this. But first, we need to really understand why you should be concerned about this and how we went from hackers being a bored person sitting on their parents' couch trying to break into a bank to all of a sudden massive farms of people working that are sponsored and are being salaried and are being paid by their particular state to deliberately go through and hack and to try to hack your organization. And we went from organizations like military and things like that would get hacked to suddenly just everyday organizations being hacked. And the way that these hackers are getting at organizations, there's multiple approaches. And one of the ones that we see a lot of nowadays is actually this concept called spearfishing. And what spearfishing is it's a more targeted take on a phishing attack. A phishing attack being where you're trying to get someone to give up their credentials by sending them, a non-targeted attack would just be spamming everybody, trying to get them to give up their bank credentials, for example. But a spear phishing attack would be one where you're specifically targeting someone within the organization, somebody that, let's say, in management, or somebody that works in finance. Somebody that can move money around is usually a person they go after, maybe someone in human resources. These are the kind of people that they'll specifically target. And it's not too difficult to determine, who works for an organization. That's, a lot of times these hackers actually will go to LinkedIn and find job titles from there. And then they will actually try to piece together the email addresses of these people. And once they have that, then they do that kind of targeted attack where they try to go directly at them. If they're really good about it, and sometimes these hackers really are, they will actually do research on that individual and try to even intercept email threads so that they can pretend that there's someone that is trusted. So if you get an email from someone that you think is one of your colleagues or someone from the outside that you knew or met at an event or somehow, and again, they can figure these things out just by looking through public posts on social media and other ways. But once they've impersonated that person, then they send you that link and they say, hey, we need you to validate your credentials or you need to do this. And these spear phishing attacks get very, very sophisticated in the way that they're actually done. So you have to be on guard all the time for someone trying to sniff out your username and password. It used to be really easy to tell because there would be a lot of misspellings in the emails, and the links that they would go to would present this login screen that was obviously not a real login screen. But now the way that it's being done right now is you'll get a page that looks like your login screen, looks very much like it. They mimic it in every way, but really you're just feeding the credentials to the attacker who then just tries to use your credentials against you. So spear phishing, the idea with the spear phishing, again, a lot of times this is financial, but sometimes it's just to get into an organization, to get one person where that they have that account, and then from there trying to sneak out and find other people within the organization who maybe have more access. So from an IT perspective, that means trying to sniff out who the domain admins are, because once you have domain admin access in an Active Directory environment, you really have a lot of problems because if the hacker gets domain admin, they can do a lot of different nefarious things. So these spear phishing attacks are oftentimes the way that these hackers get first into the organization and then they start to spread out. I mentioned these state-sponsored attacks. This is a real and growing threat. There are multiple states that are out there that specifically fund their these like I said, the large, they'll have a whole building full of people that are just going out and trying to hack organizations. And sometimes they do it because they have a grudge. If you think of like the Sony Pictures hack, that was because they produced a film that was not very flattering to a specific government, and that specific government decided to go essentially burn their IT infrastructure to the ground. And incidentally, the hackers in that case, in the Sony Pictures case, were actually in their network for several weeks, planting different devices and planting different mechanisms in place and stealing off as much data as they could before they then essentially just leveled it to the ground. And they really had to essentially build their network from scratch. So state-sponsored attacks, there's a lot more money involved. They're going after organizations because, in some cases, it's just a great way to not have to spend money on research and development, because you can just steal the research and development from an organization that already has those resources that are out there. So, so these types of state-sponsored attacks really hamper organizations today because the funding that is there is just so much more than these organizations can counter with. We see a lot of ransomware attacks. This is becoming more and more common, and essentially what a ransomware attack is that it's when someone is compromised, oftentimes through a spear phishing attack. One of the first things the hacker does is they go out and see what types of file servers or files that user has rights to. And it may just be the local files on that person's machine, but a lot of times there's servers and other centralized places where that information is stored. Once they have access to that, what happens is that they then go through and encrypt content that they have write access to, and essentially hide the keys so that it can't be decrypted unless that organization pays up in usually in cryptocurrency, something like a Bitcoin or Monero, and so of course, a lot of times most organizations don't end up paying. Sometimes they do, believe it or not, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you get the key back. We've seen organizations where if a domain admin is compromised, every single domain system that's on the network, it actually gets encrypted and rebooted, and then it just pulls up into the screen where it just says, you've been encrypted. You have to pay up, send the cryptocurrency to this address. Otherwise, you will never get access to your data again. These types of attacks hit all different sizes of organizations today. We've seen it hit small. It started to hit some small city governments, for example, who really didn't have the IT resources to be able to combat it. And there were cases where, the police had to write out paper tickets instead of, use the electronic systems that they were using. And, the local train company here actually had to open the turnstiles and just let everybody on the trains for free for, I think it was at least a day, because their systems got hit by ransomware, and nobody could even use the payments system because it was essentially just completely locked out. So ransomware attacks we see more and more often happening. Device theft is actually getting much more sophisticated. One of the things that we started to see thieves do, for example, is they will walk along a series of parked cars with a device that will detect Bluetooth signals. And so if you have a device that's hidden in the boot of your car, and you think that they can't see it, they're not going to break the window. Well, they may still break the window to pull to open up the boot and take out your device because they've sensed that device is there with these Bluetooth signals that it's generating. So that creates a problem as well too. And of course, once it's stolen, if you haven't encrypted that drive, any intellectual property that's on that device then can be easily stolen, or it can be taken from one place to the next. Encryption is something you definitely need to consider, especially the full disk encryption. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here. One of the interesting things about intellectual property loss is that the majority of it is not actually malicious. The majority of intellectual property loss is actually accidental. And a lot of times this happens with some of these modern cloud-based tools that we have because somebody just essentially overshares. They send a link to somebody, maybe they've CC'd the wrong people on it, it gets out, that link itself gets access into the data, or they put something into the cloud, into a database, and don't put the proper controls on that, and all of a sudden this database file that contains confidential information is exposed to the internet or is exposed to the wrong people. And again, it's not necessarily malicious, it's just someone makes an accident or accidentally overshares this information. And so trying to protect against that can be a challenge for a lot of organizations, because this is a method in which they lose a lot of their intellectual property just because they have the wrong controls put in place. While all this is happening, people are really, really bad at putting in passwords. And I will actually say that even though a lot of the people watching this presentation, likely you already work in IT, I guarantee you more than half of you are probably doing your passwords wrong today. And the reason I say that is that the techniques that we used over the years to create passwords, a lot of those best practices have changed completely within the past couple of years. The reason for that is that it's hackers have access to these dark web databases of hacked passwords. Currently, the biggest dark web database contains 744 million hacked passwords. Those are all unique hacked passwords that every time someone hacks into an organization and releases that information to the cloud, in the dark web, they consolidate those, they put them into databases. And especially if they're fresh passwords, they immediately then go to try and hack into those accounts. So I'll give you a scenario that's actually very common. In a lot of scenarios, let's say you're a new user at an organization. You're smart enough not to use your Facebook password as the password that you use for your organizational login. But at some later point, they say, we use this web service as well. Can you create an account on there that you will use as part of your work? And so they create an account with the same username that matches their email address because they don't want to have to remember a new username. And a lot of times they use the same corporate password because you don't want to have to try to remember a million passwords. Well, what happens then is that web service gets hacked. The hackers throw that up into the dark web databases, and those hackers then immediately will try to log in through Outlook 360 or through Office 365 or through your OWA server and try to get into your system with that hacked password. So this happens a lot, and we see this this is actually one of the reasons why a lot of these passwords get breached. So one of the things I actually recommend is to use a what we call a white hat hacker site like haveabeenpwned.com to test out passwords. You may be uncomfortable putting your actual password in there, but throw in some of your older passwords. And you will actually see if some of those older passwords were part of password breaches. Even just putting in your email address will tell you if your email address was associated with a particular breach as well too. So on a regular basis, I'm actually checking to see if my accounts are part of that particular service. The other thing to keep in mind is that passwords, humans are actually really bad at remembering long sequences of random numbers and characters, which we've been drilled in that we're supposed to be doing that. You know, if you use password generators, a lot of times they just generate this gobbledygook of characters and symbols. But humans are actually much better a series of words, what's called a passphrase. And this is, even though it's longer to type out, this is what I generally recommend that you do, is that you create a passphrase. I give an example here: yellow, birdseed, hat, pumpkin. The reason why we're better at this is that we can think to ourselves what's called a mnemonic. We can think, oh, there's yellow birdseed on a hat on a pumpkin. I'll remember my password that way, and it's easier to type it in. But yet for a computer to try to, for example, brute force that password would be nearly impossible, unless, of course, it's a password that's already existed in a dark web database. Keep that in mind. There's two different ways in which they crack the password. The first one is what's called a dictionary attack. And if your password is in any of these databases, you will have it cracked within seconds. You can get through all 744 million of those dictionary entries within seconds with just a modern password cracking tool. And the second way, though, is by brute force. And brute force, if it's unique, as long as it's long enough and it has a certain level of complexity to it, then it is extremely difficult for a computer to do that. That's why passphrases generally work out better. And I do recommend those kind of like seed words as part of passphrases when you're creating passwords. But again, the most important thing is that your password is actually globally unique. That's the key part. Make sure it's unique, that it hasn't been reused anywhere else. Other things that are creating problems for a lot of organizations: cached credentials is the #1 way in which people gain access. Well, actually, the #2 way, I should say, the spearfishing, people giving up their credentials, is surprisingly #1. But #2 is cached credentials. And I'll give you another scenario that you'll probably find is actually very common and is a little bit scary when you think about it. And that scenario is, you know, I'm that new user again. I go into my my service desk, my help desk, with a problem on my computer. And the admin that's there logs into my computer and fixes it. They log in, and let's say they log in with some kind of elevated account. A lot of times it's an Active Directory domain admin account, because maybe you just, you know, they don't necessarily have a large team, and so that person is an admin and is a domain admin. When they log in, there's a cached copy of their password that's stored on that machine. That's meant to be able to log in, allow logins from offline. So if you're disconnected from the network, you can still be able to get into your machine. Those cached credentials can be brute forced by somebody who has local admin rights to that machine. So if I, as a user, have local admin rights and I'm compromised, the hacker can then go through and proceed to start to try to hack my password. They can actually extract it out of what's called the LSASS store, and then they can run a dictionary attack first. Like I said, within seconds, that'll crack it if it's in the dark web databases, or they will run a brute force attack against it. So once they do that, they then have that domain admin's credentials, and now they can initiate that ransomware attack across the organization. So cache credentials is a huge problem, and you should consider techniques to avoid. There's some ways that you can set up where your admins don't locally cache credentials, for example. Lateral attacks, I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. A lateral attack basically just means I get into one system, I use that system to get into another system which has more credentials, I use that other system to get into another system that has even better credentials until I get to the crown jewels, right? I get to what I really want to see, the financial data, or I get to the ability to just destroy that organization to the ground. And the way that they do these things, there's actually very sophisticated attacks. One's actually an approach called a golden ticket attack. And you can use different hacking tools which are publicly available, like Mimikatz, that can create these golden tickets. And basically, if someone is a domain admin, they create this Kerberos ticket that's non-expiring. And even if someone is able to wrest control over that account again and change the password, get the hacker out of it, the hacker still has that golden ticket, and that ticket can be used to gain access to resources even after they've lost access to the account. So golden tickets attacks, those kind of things are very dangerous for organizations. So, what is it that you can do to help? And we'll go through a few techniques here, and then we'll look at a few different tools that will help you protect your intellectual property from theft. And one of the first ones is that when you think about it from a design perspective, you really need to utilize what are called these design in defense, or defense in depth, or with DID. So the concept of defense in depth is that for an attacker to gain access to your data, they have to get through multiple layers before they can get it. That way, if someone accidentally overshares in one set of data, but the data itself is encrypted and requires some other type of key, well, that's another layer. They got through one layer, they didn't get through the second layer. If they bypass your physical security, if they get into your organization, maybe you've got some other controls in place. Maybe you've got biometrics on all the machines that will automatically lock the system when someone walks away from it, as opposed to just relying on it or waiting for it to time out. All of these are different ways, different approaches. You want multiple layers to that onion to provide for that defense in depth, and you want to design your controls around that. You design your physical controls, your network controls, host-based controls, application administration, and data controls. I talked about passwords and about how we're really bad at creating passwords. And of course, one thing to take out of this is definitely use passphrases. But some people may be surprised to know that the best practice today is actually not to force your users to change their passwords that often. We have gotten so used to telling users, listen, we want you to change your password every 90 days or 60 days, or I've seen it, 30 days sometimes. You're constantly changing your password. Inevitably, what happens though, because humans are humans, the passwords just get a number sequence to the back of it. So if that user's password was password 123, 1 month, then they change it to password 1234, and then 1235. You get the idea. You're forcing them to make a change of the password, but because they're humans and they forget these things and they don't want to do the walk of shame over to the help desk to reset their password. They write it down on a sticky note and they put it under their keyboard, or they make it a very ridiculously stupid password, or they make it so similar to the last one that if you had the last one, you could easily figure out what the new one is. So these types of, for these reasons, we instead recommend you have longer passwords, make them things like passphrases, and at that point, then don't require your users to change their passwords that often. You can actually go years if you have a good globally unique password. You can go years off that password without having to change it. In fact, that's generally what I recommend, is usually about a year or so, maybe 6 months at the most ambitious, but definitely not as often as most organizations do it today. And then, of course, never reuse your passwords. But the key to never reusing your passwords, honestly, is to get yourself access to a password manager tool. So either as an organization, I do recommend organizations give their employees the use of password management tools, or from a personal perspective, using other tools. There's some open source ones that are out there, as well as there's companies like OnePass, LastPass. There's the ones that are provided on the phones. Apple has them, Google has them, etc. But that'll allow you to then, if you do need to create accounts in multiple places, you can just create a globally unique one and never have to memorize it, because at that point, then you don't care if it's the gobbledygook. You just leave that there in the password tool and have the password tool automatically add the password in when you're logging into that particular service. Hyperlink safety. This is, it goes without saying, most IT know about this today, but it's still surprising how often this still happens. One very simple thing to do is hover over the links that you have, or if it's on a mobile device, you can usually kind of see what's happening by holding it down, not necessarily clicking. It's a little bit more dangerous on a mobile device. I've gotten to the point, I'm so paranoid about this that I rarely click on any links in any email. If I get an email from someone that I'm expecting, I just log into that site manually. So if it's from my bank, I go straight to the bank. I don't click on the link in the email. And that's just because, the phishing attacks are just horrendous. They're out there all the time. This was actually a screenshot I just got from just a regular one that showed up in my my mailbox when I was writing the slide deck. And of course, I hovered over it, and you can see that the link has nothing to do with the JP Morgan Chase Bank. It's obviously some kind of a phishing attack. But again, surprisingly, people fall for these attacks all the time. Physical security is a big one, because a lot of organizations don't take this serious enough. But you'll actually see the organizations that do, they will have actually these they look like a metro or subway turnstile type entry points, where you have a long kind of gate that you walk through, and usually you're sliding your ID badge as you keep walking. And if there's more than one person, so if there's someone trying to tailgate through that, it will actually close and not let that second person through. So I've seen that much more often. It also allows a lot of people to go through, because these, again, longer, and they're just using LiDAR and other techniques to tell how many people are walking through. But tailgating is an incredibly common way for people to steal data, because once they're walking around through the organization, if you look confident enough, you look like you go where you're knowing, and it's a big enough organization and people don't know everybody that's there, it's very easy to just walk around, pick up passwords off of people underneath people's keyboards, walk around, pick up documents that are lying there, and this is a really sneaky thing that they do, they'll drop thumb drives, USB drives, all over the organization, all over the places, in the printer room, on someone's cubicle. And inevitably what people do is they go, oh, look, a free thumb drive. They stick it in their laptop. And at that point, it copies a virus across. They've got a virus sitting there. They gain access to the system. So your physical security, that's really important, as well as if you do have like a guest wireless network, make sure your guest wireless networks are completely isolated, so that you have to gain access through VPN. In fact, the modern standard is really all wireless is isolated on the outside. So even employees come in at an outside network, they don't come in the inside, and they still have to VPN in when they're coming in across the wireless. I talked about encryption. Full disk encryption is a must nowadays. You have to do this. I actually had a friend of mine do a study where they walked, they actually went through all of these different flea markets and bazaars around the world, or they had people do it. It wasn't him doing it in particular, but they went around and they bought used hard drives. And so they bought all these used hard drives, and then they brought them back and they looked at what kind of data was on these hard drives. And it was shocking how much confidential data was on these hard drives, because they were not encrypted, or they were hard drives from printers, for example. There were print queues and things like that that had stored documents, again, unencrypted. So highly important that you encrypt all your data, that you use full disk encryption, so that if you do lose a device, you're not going to be held liable for that, because you actually do get held liable with a lot of laws around this. You have to notify if there was customer data on it. It's caused huge embarrassment for a lot of organizations that are out there. So also important to put policies in place to to wipe systems remotely if they've been compromised. So that way, if there's too many failed logins, it'll just wipe out that device. Again, of course, it's connected to the network. It's easy enough to do, but using some kind of mobile device management tool for that is important. Data loss prevention is really the concept of stopping data from leaking out after it's been accessed. And so, we're very good at putting ACLs in place to protect the content from the beginning from the wrong person from accessing it. But what we're bad about is once that person has accessed it, what if that person decides to copy all that data off the server, copy it over to a thumb drive and take it outside of the organization, or find some other way to smuggle it out or sneak it out. And so that's where really having some kind of DLP, data loss prevention policies in place that can control what happens and can restrict copying and paste, can restrict printing, save as, the ability to programmatically access content. Those are highly useful and are great tools for avoiding intellectual property theft. And the number one most important thing that I would say, if you don't have in place right now, this by itself will solve a whole bunch of your headaches, including the spear phishing, including the chances of you being susceptible for ransomware attack. And it's really about turning multi-factor authentication on for your logins. I recommend this for every user within your organization if you can get away with it, if there's no restrictions in place. And the reason for that is that inevitably, one of the passwords is going to leak out. Someone's going to use a bad password. They're going to reuse a password that they had used for social media service, or they're going to use a password which just happened to be used somewhere else. Again, there's 744 million of these bad passwords that are out there. And all that hacker needs is username and password. If you don't have MFA, they can get access and get into your organization. So I highly recommend, for example, in an Office 365 environment, there's built-in and native MFA, or you can use some other of the third-party MFA providers. But by the way, there are various levels of effectiveness and security even within MFA. Starting with, at a minimum, you want to have an SMS text message. That's a good, that's better than nothing. It's better than no MFA. But the downside to that is there's a hacking technique called SIM swapping, in which the hacker calls up your mobile phone company and says, "Oh, I'm this user. Can you please transfer my phone over to this new SIM?" And it's surprising how often that's successful, because once they do that, then they have the username and password, and now they have your MFA with that SMS text. So that's not always the best. Biometrics are better, as well as if you have authenticator apps like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator apps, those are very, very good. The most effective and best way of doing multi-factor is with a hardware-based key. So some kind of hardware device that provides an additional factor, either through a certificate or via a certificate together. Usually it's the most effective ones will have a PIN that you enter together with the certificate. So that becomes the additional factors. So looking at all of these things that we talked about, Microsoft has spent a great deal of time building tool sets across their different cloud properties that help with this. And so what I've done with this particular slide here is I've actually divided up the Microsoft tools into the categories of what's called the National Institute of Security and Technology's cybersecurity framework. The cybersecurity framework creates these categories of cybersecurity that you should be looking at. So, for example, understanding how to identify your users, protecting your resources, detecting intrusions that are taking place, responding to those intrusions, and recovering from those intrusions. So these are the various Microsoft Cloud tools. We'll be talking more about these here in additional slides. But keep in mind that some of them, of course, cross multiple areas here. Cloud App Security covers a lot of these. In fact, covers 4 out of 5 of these. But I try to categorize them in areas in which, again, they're the best fit for. And keep in mind, Microsoft has changed the names on a lot of these just recently as well, too. So I'll try to talk about them where the name changes. But I wanted to start with my favorite tool. This is a fantastic tool that we'll be taking a look at. It's called Microsoft Cloud App Security, or you might hear it referred to by its acronym of MCAS. And what Cloud App Security is that it's what's called a cloud access security broker. Basically, it's a tool that allows you to look at all the different cloud properties that your users are using, identify, are they dumping a bunch of data up to Dropbox? Are they utilizing a service that was that had a known hack? Are they, are they doing something else, some type of activity on a site that's really, really poorly rated and has bad credentials? And should we be putting restrictions in place? And that's really what Cloud App Security does. Again, I'll show you a little bit more about it here, about how it works, but it's a fantastic tool that Microsoft provides for giving you insight into what's going on. And you'll get alerts that say, oh, this person shared a confidential file out on OneDrive. Should we do something about that? Or, this person uploaded 300 gigabytes of data to this cloud-based service. So you can then determine if someone is either accidentally or maliciously sharing or stealing your intellectual property with a tool like this. Microsoft 365 Defender is essentially kind of a suite of tools that Microsoft provides. These tools had different names up until recently. So one of the most important ones is actually what used to be called Defender ATP. It is now called Defender for Endpoint, or Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, MDE. That's basically, if you think of it like an anti-malware and antivirus agent, it's the Defender agent that's running on Windows, but it's centrally managed. And it also allows you to be able to do other specific type of controls, things like endpoint policies that restrict the LSASS access, or stop Adobe Acrobat from spawning executables, things that malware types of activities that happen often. So MDE is a great tool just from the perspective of being able to push it out to all your workstations and manage them, and to be able to tell if there's any type of malware or any type of service that's running on them. Other tools that are part of that, there's what's called Microsoft Defender for Office 365. That's an Office 365 based service that allows you to control and manage your security in the cloud, as well as Defender for Identity, which I've got a slide for that. We'll talk about that. That's another a great tool. Azure Defender. There's actually, it's a suite of tools within Azure. There's what's called Azure Defender for Servers, where you install the Defender agent out on your servers as opposed to the MDE, which is on the workstations. And then if you have IoT devices, there's a Defender for IoT. If you're using SQL, SQL Server, there's a Defender for SQL as well. So if you're using SQL databases in the cloud, these are various tools that allow you to control and manage your security within the cloud itself. Okay, MDE, this is probably the second most important tool as part of this. This is a fantastic tool that works by installing sensors on all of your domain controllers, and you need to install it on every domain controller, otherwise you have blind spots. You put these sensors out on all these domain controllers, and these sensors will look for things that are considered to be potentially malware-based activities. So it looks for golden ticket attacks, for example. It looks for suspicious LDAP queries, like somebody looking for all the domain admins. Someone looking at all the members of domain admins, or looking for specific people. In fact, you can fine tune it and say, I want to see if anyone's doing LDAP queries against these executives or against these important people. And it's as a tool itself, it then feeds those alerts up into MCAS. So it actually works together with MCAS. There's a hybrid. They used to be separate tools, but they merged them together now into a single tool. And those sensors feed all that data up. So you get all the alerts in the cloud itself, in Microsoft Cloud App Security. So a fantastic tool, highly recommended for getting better insight into potential intrusions that might be happening internally within your organization. Another really, really great tool, I've been using this a lot over the past year and a half, it's a SIEM, or a Security Information and Event Management platform, that's called Azure Sentinel. And what a SIEM is it's essentially like a centralized repository for placing all of your firewall and other security-based logs, that also has intelligence built on top of it to be able to alert you to activities that look bad, like alert you to botnet attacks that may be going on and attacking your firewall, or alert you to somebody changing someone's password that's a non-admin account that's changing the password. You can, set up things like that. There's also these different hunting algorithms that you can go through. They created all these different hunting policies. To give you an idea how valuable this is, many of you may be aware that a couple weeks ago, Microsoft had a massive problem with Outlook Web Access servers, where there was a zero-day attack, which someone didn't even need to log in. They just needed to gain access to an OWA server, and they could run a series of malicious commands that would allow it to then take over control over that machine. It was extremely bad. And so Microsoft came out with patches, of course, as quickly as they could. They released those patches, and the day they released those patches, they also released all of these queries for Azure Sentinel that you could run on the last 30 days worth of data to be able to tell if there was any type of activity that was associated with these types of attacks. So the organizations that had this in place, they felt so much better knowing that they hadn't been hacked because they could go through and read through and run the queries within Azure Sentinel. So Microsoft is creating all these fantastic hunting and analytics-based queries for Sentinel. And I found that it's just a fantastic tool for managing your security-related alerts. You do want it to, of course, get as much alerts and as much information from as many places as possible. So places that have it in place, we usually have additional agents. So these are different than the MDI agents, but additional agents that then push all of the security event logs up into the cloud space, because this is just an Azure Logs Analytics workspace running in the cloud is really essentially what Azure Sentinel is. A few additional tools which are useful. There's one called Azure AD Password Protection. This is a really useful tool that used to be something that you could only do with third-party services. It basically extends the capability of your Active Directory environment to apply additional controls over passwords. So you can say that the passwords have to not just be so long, because we know we can do that today, but also can't include the person's name, can't include the name of the company, can't include any of the passwords that are in the dark web databases. So it goes and checks against those. So it's a really fantastic tool, and it runs as an agent, an additional agent that gets installed on all of your domain controllers within your Active Directory environment. So definitely highly recommended to take a look at Azure AD Password Protection. Within the cloud itself, going back to the cloud, there's something called Azure AD Entitlement Management. Basically, this is a service that allows you to better control access to your Azure resources. So when Azure was new, if you needed someone to be able to do something in Azure, a lot of times you just made them a global admin and then they did the things that they need to do. Then later on, we started to say, okay, well, I'm not going to make them a global admin, but I'll make them a security admin, or I'll make them this kind of admin, because we don't want to necessarily give them all the rights. The new method is to use tools like Azure AD Entitlement Management, which allows you to put additional controls and create packages that expire after a certain period of time, so that they can only get in and do a specific task after a specific period of time. And within Azure AD Entitlement Management is this other tool called PIM, which stands for Privileged Identity Management. And PIM is a method in which you have to go through a process, a workflow, to elevate yourself to become a global admin. So, for example, the organizations in which I use, if I need to do global admin, I need to go into PIM. I need to say, this is why I'm elevating. I need to request elevation. It goes and it has to get approval, and then I'm elevated, and my elevation only lasts for a specific period of time. So it's a great way to control and to keep, someone, let's say your admin gets hacked. At least if he's hacked, he or she is hacked, then it doesn't necessarily mean that your Azure space gets hacked as well, too. The on-prem version of PIM is something called PAM. Not necessarily a lot of organizations use this. I think it's a little bit, in my opinion, it's kind of a very overcomplicated solution for a lot of organizations. But keep in mind, there is an on-prem version that will do the same type of thing. It actually runs with a portal that sits on top of Microsoft Identity Manager. But the important thing about this slide that I want to kind of demonstrate is the concept of the bastion forest is a concept that you can use with or without MIM or PAM. The concept is that you have a separate forest that has just a one-way trust. So it doesn't trust your corporate forest, but the corporate forest trusts it. And your admin accounts are all in your bastion environment. So those admin accounts then are added in as, let's say, domain admins, or are added into other privileged groups within your Active Directory environment. So Bastion environments are really the future for how organizations can prevent when someone's in it or someone gains access from being able to, from going out to then, encrypt everything or just destroy everything before they get kicked out of that organization. A couple additional tools. Azure Information Protection. I talked about the DLP policies. Well, this is Microsoft's approach to the DLP policies. They have services like Azure Rights Management Services that will then control what happens to that content so that you can restrict the copy and pasting of content. You can restrict them saving it as a new version, or you can put additional restrictions in place. And that's all controlled by the Azure Information Protection policies. Okay, I wanted to quickly show a demo here of Cloud App Security, and then hopefully give you guys a few minutes for questions here. But this is a demo environment that I spun up within Microsoft. They have a demo space, so bear in mind there's not necessarily going to be a lot of activity here, but it is preceded with some activity, some alerts. We'll see, for example, in this case, this is kind of a funny alert. This was me logging in from the US, which it saw as a country that's not used that often because it's a tendency that's not used that often. But in mature organizations, you'll see this show up when someone logs in from, let's say, Serbia, and you don't have a presence in Serbia. You'll get an alert that says, hey, this person's logged in from that location. Or I see there's some kind of suspicious admin activity, different types of sessions that were done. There was resetting passwords. A whole bunch of passwords were reset. Maybe I should investigate that. Other ones, I can see that there's these risky OAuth applications. In this case, it's the one that Microsoft used to create this particular demo. But at the same time, if I want to take a look at different activities, take a look at what's going on, what people are doing, I can get a log of different services that are being logged into. I can take a look at what specific users were doing at specific times. Looks like this user, oh yeah, here we did. This user ran a few specific commands. I can take a look at the usage of different applications in the cloud. So I can see which IP addresses were being used, which end users were using it, what kind of traffic was out there. I can see if this traffic, I see there's a lot of traffic to OneDrive, maybe that's okay, but Box, I wanted to investigate this a little bit more. I can take a look and see, what type of activity is out here, export out this activity, look into it in a little bit more detail, determine whether or not, there's a problem, whether or not I should be looking at things. This, for example, you see this reputation score. Microsoft scores these different companies based on reputation. So you see this one is not very highly, doesn't have a very good reputation. It's only rated 5. So you can actually go through and tag these things as unsanctioned and keep your end users from actually using those particular applications. So again, just kind of a fantastic tool for getting an understanding of what's out there, which users are using your service. If there's applications which have if there's applications which have been compromised, it'll actually tell you that. It'll say this particular application was compromised at this particular date. Or I can see, again, this is a mass download, and I'd see maybe this is something I want to take a look at in a little bit more detail. I can suspend the user. I can require them to log in again if I think that they've been compromised. Again, this is just one of the tools. I don't have access. There's no demo version of Sentinel that I could show you. I wish I could show you Sentinel, but Sentinel is a great tool that has similar types of capabilities built into it. Okay, I am going to take us into the portion of the session that deals with questions. So hopefully, if you have any questions, I would love to hear them and I would love to answer them. We have about 8 minutes left for questions. And if you don't have any questions, I do thank you for coming. I would say to you, Yanyavad. I don't know if I said that right, but hopefully I did. But thank you, and please let me know if you have any specific questions.